Blood dripped onto the concrete floor of the police station locker room. Sarah Martinez wiped her split lip with the back of her hand, her two front teeth now chipped and painful. Around her, 3 veteran officers laughed as they walked away, their message clear. Rookies don't belong here, especially female rookies who think they can play with the big boys. What they didn't know was that the quiet 24-year-old they'd just assaulted had spent the last 6 years in the Navy SEALs, completing missions that would give them nightmares. Her black belt in multiple martial arts wasn't just a hobby. It was a weapon she'd used to save lives in the darkest corners of the world. As Sarah touched her broken teeth, something shifted in her eyes. The scared rookie facade crumbled away, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. These bullies had just made the biggest mistake of their careers, and they had no idea what was coming for them. The transformation was about to begin, and by the time it was over, everyone would know that sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who can destroy everything you thought you knew about power. Sarah Martinez stood in front of the mirror in the women's locker room at the 15th precinct, adjusting her brand-new police uniform for the 3rd time. The badge felt heavy on her chest, heavier than any of the gear she'd carried during her 6 years as a Navy SEAL. But this weight was different. This was the weight of a new beginning, a chance to serve her community in a way that didn't involve night raids in foreign countries or eliminating targets in the shadows. At 24, Sarah looked younger than her years. Her 5 feet 4 inches frame was compact, but muscular, though she'd learned to hide her strength under loose clothing. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her brown eyes held a quiet intensity that most people mistook for shyness. She'd spent months preparing for this transition from military to civilian law enforcement, studying police procedures and local laws with the same dedication she'd once applied to memorizing terrorist compound layouts. The morning briefing had gone smoothly enough. Captain Reynolds, a gruff man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes, had introduced her to the squad with minimal fanfare. This is Officer Martinez, fresh out of the academy. She'll be partnering with Detective Murphy for her first few weeks. The other officers had barely looked up from their coffee and paperwork. To them, she was just another rookie who would either make it or wash out within the first year. Detective Murphy turned out to be a pleasant surprise. A 45-year-old veteran with laugh lines around his eyes and a gentle demeanor, he'd spent the morning showing Sarah the ropes without condescension. The thing about police work, he'd said as they drove through their assigned patrol area, is that it's 90% paperwork and community interaction, 10% actual danger. The academy probably taught you the opposite. Sarah had nodded, not mentioning that she'd seen enough danger in her military career to last several lifetimes. She was looking forward to the 90%. Their first call had been a domestic disturbance that turned out to be a noise complaint about a neighbor's music. The second was a fender bender with no injuries and minimal property damage. By lunch, Sarah was beginning to think that civilian policing might actually be the peaceful career change she'd been hoping for. That was before she met officers Jake Morrison, Tony Ricci, and Brad Stevens. The 3 men were legends in the precinct, though not necessarily for good reasons. Morrison, the apparent leader of the group, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with sandy brown hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He'd been on the force for 8 years and had a reputation for being tough on crime, which Sarah quickly learned was code for being rough with suspects. Ricci was shorter but built like a bulldozer, with thick arms covered in tattoos and a perpetual scowl. Stevens was the youngest of the 3, maybe 26 or 27, with red hair and freckles that made him look innocent until he opened his mouth. They cornered Sarah during her lunch break, when she was sitting alone in the break room, eating a sandwich and reading through the department manual. Well, Morrison said, sliding into the chair across from her uninvited. If it isn't our new baby cop. Sarah looked up from her manual, keeping her expression neutral. Officer Morrison, you can call me Jake, sweetheart. We're all friends here. His tone suggested anything but friendship. Ricci and Stevens flanked her on either side, effectively boxing her in. I'm just trying to eat my lunch, Sarah said quietly. That's what I'm talking about, Stevens said with a laugh. Always so polite, so proper. Like a little schoolgirl playing dress-up. Sarah set down her sandwich. She could feel the familiar cold calm settling over her, the same feeling she'd gotten just before engaging hostile targets overseas. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Iraq. These were her colleagues, and she was trying to start fresh. Is there something you need from me? As a matter of fact, there is, Morrison said, leaning forward. See, We've been watching you, Martinez, and we're a little concerned. Concerned about what? About whether you've got what it takes to do this job, Ricci chimed in. This isn't some desk job where you can hide behind paperwork. Out there on the streets, you need to be tough. You need to be someone criminals will respect. Sarah almost laughed at that. If they only knew about the Taliban fighters who'd learned to respect her the hard way, or the arms dealers who'd never seen her coming in the dead of night. Instead, she kept her voice level. I think I can handle myself. That's exactly the problem, Morrison said. You think. You don't know. And when you're out there with one of us as your partner, your thinking might get us killed. I've been partnered with Detective Murphy. He hasn't expressed any concerns. Murphy's a softie, Stephen said dismissively. He's not going to tell you the truth about what it takes to survive out here. But we will. And what's that? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. You need to prove yourself, Morrison said. Show us that you're not just another quota hire, another female officer who's going to fold the first time things get real. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Quota. Come on, Martinez. We all know how this works. Department needs more women, more minorities. They lower the standards, push people through who shouldn't be wearing a badge. Morrison's smile was ugly now. Nothing personal, but facts are facts. For a moment, Sarah was silent. She thought about the 2 years of SEAL training that had nearly broken her, where she'd been one of only 3 women to even attempt the program, and the only one to complete it. She thought about the missions where she'd saved the lives of men twice her size, about the terrorists who'd underestimated her right up until she put them down. She thought about the Congressional Medal of Honor recommendation that was still classified, buried in some Pentagon file cabinet. But these men didn't know any of that. As far as they were concerned, she was just a small woman who'd somehow slipped through the cracks. So what exactly are you proposing? She asked. Simple, Morrison said. After shift tonight, you meet us in the old training room downstairs. We'll run you through some scenarios, see how you handle yourself in a real confrontation. If you pass, we'll know you're serious. If you don't, he shrugged. Maybe you should consider a different career path. Sarah looked at each of them in turn. She could see the anticipation in their eyes, the barely concealed excitement. This wasn't about testing her abilities. This was about humiliation, about putting the new girl in her place. They probably did this to every rookie they didn't like, male or female. The smart thing would be to decline, to report them to Captain Reynolds or Internal Affairs. But Sarah had spent 6 years in an environment where backing down from a challenge was the fastest way to lose respect. And despite everything, she still needed to work with these people. Maybe it would be better to get this over with now. Fine, she said. What time? 7:30, Morrison said. After the day's shift clears out. Just you and us, nice and private. As they walked away, Sarah heard Stephen say something under his breath about teaching the rookie some manners. She pretended not to hear, but her hands clenched involuntarily under the table. The rest of her shift passed normally. Murphy continued showing her the various neighborhoods in their patrol area, pointing out the trouble spots, and introducing her to local business owners. He was a good teacher, patient and thorough, and under different circumstances Sarah would have been enjoying herself. But her mind kept drifting to the evening's appointment. She'd been in situations like this before, though not as a police officer. In the military, there were always a few soldiers who needed to test the newcomer, especially if that newcomer was different from them in some way. Usually, a solid demonstration of competence was enough to settle things. But something about Morrison and his friends felt different. There was a mean streak there, a genuine hostility that went beyond simple hazing. She'd seen men like that before, usually in bars near military bases, picking fights with anyone they perceived as weaker than themselves. As 7 o'clock approached, Sarah found herself changing back into civilian clothes in the locker room. She chose dark jeans and a plain black t-shirt, clothing that would allow her to move freely. Old habits died hard. The precinct was mostly empty by the time she made her way downstairs to the old training room. It was a relic from the building's earlier days, with worn mats on the floor and outdated equipment pushed against the walls. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across the space. Morrison, Ricci, and Stevens were waiting for her, all of them having changed out of their uniforms as well. They looked relaxed, confident. Morrison had a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Glad you could make it, Martinez, he said. For a while there, I thought you might chicken out. I said I'd be here, Sarah replied simply. Good. Now, before we start, let's establish some ground rules. What happens in this room stays in this room. We're all professionals here, just helping a colleague improve her skills. Understood, Sarah nodded, though alarm bells were going off in her head. The phrasing was too careful, too rehearsed. These men had done this before. Excellent. Now, let's start with something simple. Tony here is going to play the role of a suspect resisting arrest. Your job is to subdue him and get him cuffed. Think you can handle that? Ricci stepped forward, rolling his shoulders and cracking his knuckles. He was at least 6 inches taller than Sarah and probably outweighed her by 80 pounds. To most observers, it would look like a completely unfair fight. Sarah assessed him quickly, noting his stance, the way he carried his weight, the slight favor he showed his left leg that suggested an old injury. In her SEAL days, she'd taken down men twice his size without breaking a sweat. But these weren't enemy combatants, and she wasn't in a war zone. She needed to be careful. Whenever you're ready, Morrison said. Ricci lunged forward, moving faster than his bulk suggested possible. But to Sarah, who trained against some of the military's best hand-to-hand combat specialists, he seemed to be moving in slow motion. She sidestepped easily, using his momentum against him to send him stumbling past her. Lucky, Ricci muttered, turning to face her again. This time he approached more cautiously, trying to grab her in a bear hug. Sarah ducked under his arms and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the mat. Before he could recover, she had his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that would have let her cuff him if she'd had handcuffs. Not bad, Morrison said, though his tone suggested he wasn't pleased. But Tony was going easy on you. Let's try something a little more realistic. Brad, your turn. Stevens was quicker than Ricci, with longer reach. But he made the mistake of telegraphing his moves, probably assuming that Sarah wouldn't be able to counter them anyway. She proved him wrong, using a combination of joint locks and pressure points to put him on the ground in under 30 seconds. Now Morrison wasn't smiling at all. Interesting. You've had some training. Academy covers basic self-defense, Sarah said, though that was a massive understatement. Right? The Academy. Morrison stepped onto the mat himself. Well, let's see how Academy training holds up against 8 years of street experience. Sarah immediately knew this was going to be different. Morrison moved like someone who'd been in real fights, not just training scenarios. His stance was balanced, his hands up but relaxed. When he came at her, it was with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight he couldn't walk away from. But he'd never fought a Navy SEAL before. Sarah let him get closer than she had the others, wanting to gauge his skill level before responding. When he threw a quick jab toward her face, she slipped it easily and responded with a palm strike to his solar plexus that would have dropped most people. Morrison absorbed the hit better than she'd expected, wrapping his arms around her and trying to wrestle her to the ground. For a moment they grappled, and Sarah had to admit he was stronger than she'd anticipated. But strength wasn't everything. She shifted her weight and used a hip throw that sent Morrison flying across the mat. He landed hard but rolled with the impact coming up in a crouch. For the first time, she saw genuine surprise in his eyes. Where the hell did you learn to fight like that? He demanded. I told you, Academy training. Bullshit. Morrison got to his feet, his face flushed. Nobody learns moves like that at the police academy. Sarah shrugged. Maybe you weren't paying attention in your classes. That was the wrong thing to say. She saw Morrison's expression change, saw the shift from surprise to anger. What had started as a test was now personal. You think you're better than us? He asked quietly. I think I've proven I can handle myself. Have you? Morrison glanced at Ricci and Stevens, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Because so far, you've only faced one of us at a time. Real fights aren't so neat and organized. Before Sarah could respond, all 3 of them were moving. She'd been expecting this, had seen it coming from the moment Morrison's ego got bruised. But expecting it and being prepared for it were 2 different things, especially when she was trying to hold back enough to avoid seriously injuring anyone. She took down Stevens first, a quick elbow to his ribs that sent him gasping to his knees. But while she was dealing with him, Ricci got behind her and wrapped his arms around her chest, pinning her arms to her sides. Morrison stepped in front of her, his face twisted with anger. Not so tough now, are you, rookie? Let go of me, Sarah said calmly. Or what? You'll report us? Who's going to believe that 3 decorated officers assaulted a rookie without provocation? Morrison leaned closer. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to submit your resignation tomorrow morning. You're going to tell Captain Reynolds that you've decided police work isn't for you. And you're never going to speak about what happened here tonight. Sarah looked him in the eye. No, Morrison's fist came out of nowhere, catching her across the jaw hard enough to snap her head to the side. Pain exploded through her face, and she tasted blood. "Wrong answer," Morrison said. The second punch broke her teeth. As Sarah spit blood onto the mat, she felt something inside her shift. The careful control she'd maintained all evening, the restraint she'd shown because these were supposed to be her colleagues, evaporated like morning mist. These men had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd moved from intimidation to assault, from testing to genuine violence. And they had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Sarah's training kicked in, muscle memory from hundreds of combat situations where holding back meant death. She drove her heel down hard on Ricci's instep, feeling bones crunch under her boot. As his grip loosened in pain, she threw her head back, catching him in the nose with enough force to break it. Free now, she spun to face Morrison, who was staring at her in shock. Blood was streaming down her chin from her broken teeth, but her eyes were completely calm. "You made a mistake," she said quietly. Morrison swung again, but this time Sarah was ready. She caught his wrist, twisted it until she heard something pop, and drove her knee into his ribs with enough force to crack them. He folded over, gasping. Stevens tried to grab her from behind, but Sarah had already sensed him coming. She spun and caught him with a backhand that sent him crashing into the wall. When he tried to get up, she put him down again with a precise strike to a nerve cluster that would leave his left arm numb for hours. In less than 10 seconds, all three men were on the ground, groaning and bleeding. Sarah wiped the blood from her mouth and looked down at them. Part of her wanted to finish what they'd started, to show them exactly what a Navy SEAL was capable of when the gloves came off. But she was a police officer now, or trying to be. That had to mean something. "Here's what's going to happen," she said in the same calm tone Morrison had used earlier. "You're going to forget this ever happened. All of it. And you're going to stay out of my way from now on." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and if any of you ever lay a hand on another rookie, male or female, I'll hear about it. And next time, I won't be nearly so gentle." As she walked toward the door, Morrison managed to gasp out, Who the hell are you?" Sarah paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. "I'm Officer Martinez, and I think you'll find I'm exactly what this department needs." She left them there, bleeding and confused, and walked out of the precinct into the night air. Her teeth throbbed where they'd been broken, and her jaw was already starting to swell. She needed to see a dentist in the morning. But as she drove home through the quiet streets, Sarah found herself smiling despite the pain. For the first time since leaving the military, she felt like herself again. Not the quiet rookie trying to fit in, but the warrior she'd always been. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She'd have to explain her injuries somehow, probably with a story about falling downstairs or walking into a door. Morrison and his friends would be nursing their own wounds and their bruised egos trying to figure out what had just happened to them. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Sarah Martinez had drawn a line in the sand, and anyone who crossed it would discover that the quiet rookie was anything but defenseless. The transformation had begun. Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her small apartment, carefully examining the damage. Her jaw was swollen and discolored, a purple bruise spreading across the left side of her face. Her bottom lip was split and still tender to the touch. But it was her teeth that concerned her most. The two front ones were chipped badly, with sharp edges that cut her tongue when she talked. She'd seen worse injuries during her military service, both on herself and others. But those had been sustained in legitimate combat operations, fighting enemies of her country. This damage had been inflicted by fellow police officers, men who were supposed to be on her side. Sarah opened her laptop and searched for emergency dental services. She found a clinic that opened at 6 a.m. and made a note to call them as soon as they opened. The broken teeth would need to be fixed quickly, both for appearance and function. She couldn't report for duty looking like she'd been in a bar fight. As she prepared for bed, Sarah's mind replayed the events in the training room. The look of shock on Morrison's face when she'd broken his wrist still brought her a grim satisfaction. These men had expected easy prey, a frightened rookie they could intimidate into quitting. Instead, they'd encountered something they weren't prepared for. But Sarah knew this was far from over. Men like Morrison didn't accept humiliation easily, especially not from someone they considered beneath them. They'd be looking for revenge, or at least a way to salvage their damaged reputations. She needed to be ready for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Murphy, hope your first day went well. See you tomorrow at 0700 for briefing. Sarah typed back, thanks. Looking forward to it. If only he knew what had really happened. The dental clinic was efficient, but expensive. Dr. Patricia Williams, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and steady hands, examined Sarah's injuries with professional concern. These are significant chips, she said, probing gently with her instruments. What happened? Sarah had rehearsed her story during the drive over. Slipped on wet tiles in my bathroom last night. Went down hard and caught the edge of the sink. Dr. Williams nodded sympathetically. I've seen similar injuries from bathroom falls. You're lucky you didn't knock them out completely. I can do temporary crowns today to restore function and appearance, but you'll need to come back for permanent ones once the swelling goes down. 2 hours and $800 later, Sarah's teeth looked almost normal again. The temporary crowns felt strange in her mouth, but they would hold up under normal use. She needed to be careful about what she ate for the next few weeks. The precinct was buzzing with its usual morning activity when Sarah arrived at 6:50 a.m. She'd applied makeup to cover most of the bruising on her jaw, though careful observers might still notice something was off. She kept her head down and made her way to the briefing room. Murphy was already there, reviewing case files and drinking coffee from a mug that read World's Okayest Detective. He looked up as she approached and immediately frowned. Sarah, what happened to your face? She'd been dreading this moment. Murphy was observant and experienced. Lying to him wouldn't be easy, but she stuck to her prepared story. Had a stupid accident last night. Slipped in my bathroom and hit the sink. Nothing serious, just embarrassing. Murphy studied her face more closely. Sarah forced herself to remain still under his scrutiny, keeping her expression neutral. After a moment, he seemed to accept her explanation. Ouch, that looks painful. You sure you're up for duty today? I'm Fina. Just some soreness. All right, but if you start feeling dizzy or nauseous, you tell me immediately. Head injuries are nothing to mess around with. Sarah nodded, touched by his genuine concern. It was a sharp contrast to the treatment she'd received from Morrison and his crew. The morning briefing proceeded normally. Captain Reynolds went over the previous day's incidents and outlined priorities for the current shift. Sarah noticed that Morrison, Ricci, and Stevens were all present, though they looked uncomfortable. Morrison's right wrist was in a brace, which he'd apparently explained as a training injury. Ricci had a bandage across his nose and 2 spectacular black eyes. Stevens kept his left arm close to his body, moving it gingerly. None of them looked in Sarah's direction during the briefing. Anything else before we head out? Captain Reynolds asked. Actually, yes, Morrison said, raising his good hand. I wanted to address something with the new officer. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression blank. Officer Martinez, Morrison continued, I know we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I wanted to apologize for that. Sometimes the stress of this job makes us forget that we're all on the same team. The words sounded sincere, but Sarah could see the calculation behind Morrison's eyes. He was trying to control the narrative, to make it look like any tensions between them were minor misunderstandings rather than something more serious. Apology accepted, Sarah said simply. Good. I'm glad we can put that behind us and move forward professionally. Captain Reynolds nodded approvingly. That's what I like to hear. We're all part of the same family here. As the briefing broke up, Murphy fell in a step beside Sarah. Everything okay between you and Morrison? Of course. Why wouldn't it be? I don't know. Something seemed a little tense there. And it's unusual for Jake to make public apologies. He's usually more of a deal with it privately kind of guy. Sarah chose her words carefully. Maybe he's trying to be more supportive of new officers. Murphy gave her a sideways look, but didn't press the issue. They walked to their patrol car in comfortable silence. The day started routinely enough. They responded to a shoplifting call at a convenience store, with a suspect turned out to be a homeless man trying to steal food. Rather than arrest him, Murphy convinced the store owner to let the man work off his debt by sweeping the parking lot and cleaning windows. It was exactly the kind of community-oriented policing Sarah had hoped to be part of. Their second call was a domestic disturbance in a run-down apartment complex. As they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, Sarah could hear shouting through the thin walls. This is usually where things get complicated, Murphy said quietly. Domestic calls are some of the most dangerous we respond to. People are emotional, often drunk or high, and they know the space better than we do. The shouting got louder as they approached apartment 3B. Through the door, They could hear a man's voice raised in anger and a woman's voice pleading with him to calm down. Murphy knocked firmly. "Police. Open the door, please." The shouting stopped abruptly. After a moment, they heard footsteps, and the door opened to reveal a thin woman in her 30s with disheveled hair and red-rimmed eyes. She was wearing a bathrobe that she clutched tightly around herself. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about noise from this apartment. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," the woman said quickly, but her eyes darted nervously back into the apartment. "Just a misunderstanding." Sarah could see past the woman into the living room, where a large man with a beer gut and greasy hair was glaring at them from beside an overturned coffee table. His knuckles were scraped, and there was an angry red mark on his neck. "Could we come in and talk for a minute?" Murphy asked gently, "just to make sure everyone's okay." "That won't be necessary," the man called from behind the woman. Like she said, just a misunderstanding. But Sarah noticed something that Murphy couldn't see from his angle. The woman's left wrist was swollen and already showing signs of bruising. Someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. "Ma'am," Sarah said quietly, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" The woman's eyes widened in fear. I don't think that's—" "Jennifer, get back in here," the man commanded. These officers were just leaving. The woman, Jennifer, flinched at his tone. Sarah had seen that reaction before, in military households where domestic abuse was kept behind closed doors. The fear, the automatic obedience, the desperate attempt to minimize the situation. Murphy was following proper procedure, trying to de-escalate and gather information. But Sarah could see that time was running out. The man was getting agitated, and Jennifer was terrified of what would happen after they left. "Sir," Murphy said, "could you step outside with me for a moment? I'd like to ask you a few questions." "I don't have to answer any damn questions. This is my home." "You're absolutely right," Murphy agreed. "But it would help us clear this up quickly so we can get out of your way." The man hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to get rid of the police and not wanting to leave Jennifer alone with Sarah. Suspicion won out. "Whatever you want to ask, you can ask it right here." Sarah decided to take a different approach. "Ma'am, could you show me where your bathroom is? I just need to wash my hands." It was a weak excuse, but it might give her a chance to talk to Jennifer alone. The woman looked confused, but nodded. "It's just down the hall." Sarah followed Jennifer deeper into the apartment, acutely aware of the man's eyes on her back. The bathroom was small and dimly lit, with a cracked mirror and peeling wallpaper. "Jennifer," Sarah said quietly once they were out of earshot, "that bruising on your wrist looks painful. How did it happen?" Jennifer immediately pulled her robe sleeve down to cover the marks. "I fell earlier. Clumsy me. I've seen a lot of injuries in my time," Sarah said gently. "That looks like grip bruising to me. Someone grabbed you pretty hard." Tears started forming in Jennifer's eyes, but she shook her head. "You don't understand. He's not usually like this. He's been under a lot of stress at work, and he's been drinking more. But he's a good man, really." Sarah had heard variations of this speech dozens of times during her military service. The base counselors had trained all the SEALs to recognize signs of domestic abuse, since it was unfortunately common in high-stress military families. "I'm sure he can be," Sarah said. "But good people don't leave bruises on the people they love." "You can't know what it's like," Jennifer whispered. "He supports me, gives me a place to live. Without him, I'd be on the streets. And he's promised to get help. He's going to stop drinking." "Jennifer, listen to me," Sarah said, keeping her voice low but urgent. "I can see that you care about him, but this isn't your fault, and it's not going to get better on its own. Men who hurt women they claim to love don't stop unless they face real consequences." "He's never actually hit me," Jennifer said desperately. "Just grab me when he gets angry. It's not that bad." Before Sarah could respond, the man's voice boomed from the living room. "What the hell is taking so long in there?" Jennifer's face went pale with terror. "He's getting angry. You need to leave. Please." Sarah wanted to arrest the man on the spot, to drag Jennifer out of there and put her somewhere safe. But she couldn't act without evidence of a crime, and Jennifer wasn't willing to press charges. All she could do was plant seeds and hope they would grow. She pulled out one of her business cards and pressed it into Jennifer's hand. "My name is Officer Martinez. If you ever need help, if things ever get worse, you call me directly. Day or night. I will come, and I will help you get out safely." Jennifer stared at the card like it was a lifeline. I can't. Just keep it," Sarah said. "Hide it somewhere he won't find it." And remember, this isn't your fault. They returned to the living room, where Murphy was still trying to calm the increasingly agitated man. Everything all right, ladies? The man asked, his tone deceptively casual. Everything's fine, Sarah said. Just needed to freshen up. Murphy caught her eye and nodded slightly. He'd gotten the same read on the situation that she had, but without evidence or a willing victim, their hands were tied. Well, thank you both for your time, Murphy said politely. We'll let you get back to your evening. As they walked back down the stairs, Sarah felt frustrated and angry. She knew that Jennifer was going to suffer for their visit, that the man would take out his anger on her as soon as the police were gone. That was a tough one, Murphy said once they were back in their patrol car. You could see she was scared, but she's not ready to ask for help yet. Does it ever get easier? Sarah asked, knowing you're leaving someone in danger? Murphy was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally. It never gets easier. But sometimes planting the seed is all you can do. Maybe someday, she'll remember that card you gave her and find the courage to use it. Sarah was surprised that he'd noticed. Murphy was more observant than he let on. I hope so. They spent the rest of the shift on routine calls. A minor traffic accident, a teenager caught spray painting a wall, an elderly man who'd locked himself out of his apartment. Normal police work, the kind that didn't make headlines but was the backbone of community safety. It wasn't until they were back at the precinct, filling out paperwork at the end of their shift, that Sarah noticed Morrison watching her from across the room. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Something wrong? Murphy asked, noticing her distraction. No, nothing wrong. But Sarah knew that wasn't true. Morrison was planning something. She could feel it. The public apology had been theater, a way to make himself look reasonable while he figured out his next move. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially not from women they considered inferior. As she gathered her things to leave, Morrison approached her desk. Murphy had stepped away to make copies, leaving them momentarily alone. Interesting day, Martinez, Morrison said quietly. Very routine, Sarah replied without looking up from her paperwork. I heard you, and Murphy had a domestic call. Those could be tricky situations. Now Sarah did look up. There was something in Morrison's tone that put her on alert. We handled it appropriately. I'm sure you did. It's just that domestic situations can be educational. They show you how quickly things can escalate, how easy it is for someone to get hurt when they don't know their place. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah set down her pen and met his gaze directly. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, Officer Morrison? Morrison's smile widened. Not at all. Just making conversation with a colleague. After all, we're all part of the same family here, right? Before Sarah could respond, Murphy returned with his copies. Morrison immediately switched back to his public persona, the concerned senior officer looking out for a rookie. Just welcoming Officer Martinez to the team, he said cheerfully, making sure she knows we're all here to support her. That's great to hear, Murphy said. Sarah's been doing excellent work today. Real natural instincts for community policing. I'm sure she has many hidden talents, Morrison said, still looking at Sarah. The kind that might surprise people. After Morrison walked away, Murphy settled back into his chair. Jake seems to be making an effort to be more welcoming. That's good to see. Sarah nodded absently, but her mind was elsewhere. Morrison's message had been clear. He hadn't forgotten what happened in the training room, and he was far from finished with her. The domestic call had reminded him that there were other ways to hurt someone besides direct confrontation. As she drove home that night, Sarah found herself checking her rearview mirror more often than usual. She was being paranoid, she told herself. Morrison wouldn't try anything overt. He was too smart for that, too aware of how it would look if something happened to the rookie he'd publicly apologized to. But paranoia had kept her alive through 6 years of special operations, and it wasn't a habit she was ready to break now. Her apartment felt different when she walked in, though she couldn't immediately put her finger on why. Everything was where she'd left it. Nothing had been moved or taken. But there was something in the air, a sense that her space had been invaded. Sarah did a careful sweep of the apartment, checking for signs of entry. The locks were intact, the windows secure. Her laptop was still on her desk, her jewelry box untouched. But when she checked her bedroom, she found it, a single photograph on her pillow, face down. With a growing sense of dread, Sarah picked up the photograph and turned it over. It was a picture of her in her Navy SEAL uniform, taken during a ceremony where she'd received a commendation for valor. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. Someone had taken a red marker and drawn an X across her face. Sarah sank onto her bed, staring at the photograph. This was impossible. Her military records were classified. Her service with the SEALs was known to only a handful of people in the Pentagon. There was no way Morrison could have gotten access to this information, unless someone with clearance was helping him. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Commander Sarah Chun, her former commanding officer in the SEALs. It was late on the East Coast, but Chun had always told her team members to call if they needed help, regardless of the hour. Martinez? Is that really you? Chin's voice was warm with surprise and pleasure. How are you adjusting to civilian life? Actually, ma'am, I'm calling because I think I might have a problem. Sarah explained the situation as briefly as possible. Her new job with the LAPD, the confrontation with Morrison and his friends, and now the photograph. Chin listened without interrupting, her silence growing more ominous as the story continued. Sarah, Chin said finally, that photograph. There are only 3 copies in existence. One is in your personnel file at the Pentagon, one is in the base archives, and one should be in your possession. It's not mine, ma'am. I left all my military photos with my parents when I moved to LA. Then, someone with very high-level clearance accessed your file. And that means this isn't just about local police politics anymore. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that someone wanted those officers to know exactly who they were dealing with. The question is why, and whether they're planning to help you or hurt you. As Sarah hung up the phone, she stared again at the defaced photograph. Her carefully planned transition to civilian life was falling apart, and she was starting to realize that the danger she faced might be far greater than she'd imagined. Someone was playing a very dangerous game, and they just made it personal. Sarah barely slept that night. Every sound in her apartment building made her reach for the service weapon she kept in her bedside drawer. The photograph lay on her nightstand, its red X seeming to mock her in the darkness. Someone had violated her privacy, her security, and potentially her future in ways she was only beginning to understand. By 5 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, trying to piece together what had happened and who might be behind it. The break-in to her apartment had been professional. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, just a photograph left as a message. That level of skill suggested someone with training, possibly military or intelligence background. But the real question was how anyone had accessed her classified military records. Commander Chun had been right. There were only 3 copies of that photograph, and access to her personnel file required top-secret clearance and a legitimate need to know. Someone in the Pentagon had either leaked her information or been compromised themselves. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Murphy, running late this morning. Can you handle the briefing solo, and I'll catch up with you afterward. She texted back her agreement, then finished her coffee and prepared for what she expected to be a challenging day. The confrontation with Morrison was escalating beyond simple workplace harassment, and she needed to be ready for anything. The precinct felt different when Sarah arrived for the morning briefing. Officers who had barely acknowledged her existence before now watched her with undisguised curiosity. Word had apparently spread about Morrison's public apology, and people were wondering what had prompted it. Captain Reynolds ran through the usual assignments and updates, then paused before dismissing the group. One more thing, he said. I've been getting reports about some tension between officers lately. I want to make it clear that this department operates as a team, and personal conflicts need to be resolved professionally. Anyone who can't work together effectively will find themselves looking for a new career. Are we clear? The room murmured its agreement, but Sarah noticed several officers glancing in her direction. Someone had been talking, spreading rumors about what had happened between her and Morrison's crew. She kept her expression neutral, but internally, she was calculating how quickly her situation could deteriorate if the wrong story got around. After the briefing, Sarah found herself partnered with Detective Lisa Park, a sharp-eyed Asian woman in her early 30s who specialized in financial crimes. Murphy was testifying in court for most of the day, and Park had volunteered to take the rookie under her wing. I heard you had some excitement on your first day, Park said as they settled into their patrol car. Nothing I couldn't handle, Sarah replied carefully. Park studied her for a moment. You know, I've been working this job for 8 years, and I've learned to read people pretty well. You don't carry yourself like most rookies. What do you mean? Most new officers are either overconfident or scared out of their minds. You're neither. You move like someone who's seen combat, someone who's been in real danger before. Park started the car and pulled out of the parking garage. Want to tell me where you learned to fight like that? Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Like what? Come on, Martinez. Half the station is talking about Morrison's training injury and how Ricci walked into a door. Those guys have been bullying rookies for years, and suddenly, all three of them show up to work looking like they went 10 rounds with a heavyweight boxer. For a moment, Sarah considered telling Park the truth. The detective seemed genuinely concerned, and having an ally in the department could be valuable. But Commander Chin's warning echoed in her mind. Someone with high-level clearance was involved, and she couldn't trust anyone until she knew who. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah said. Park sighed. Look, I'm not trying to get you in trouble. Those three have been a problem for a long time, and if someone finally put them in their place, good for them. But you need to be careful. Morrison has friends in this department, and he's not the type to let something like this go. Before Sarah could respond, their radio crackled with a call. All units, we have a possible break-in at 1247 Oak Street. Silent alarm was triggered 15 minutes ago. Park grabbed the radio. Unit 23 responding. ETA 5 minutes. As they raced toward the scene, Sarah tried to focus on the job ahead. But she couldn't shake the feeling that every call, every interaction, was somehow connected to the larger game being played around her. The address turned out to be a small electronics store in a rundown strip mall. The front windows were intact, and there were no obvious signs of forced entry. Park parked across the street, and they approached the building cautiously. Owner's name is David Kim, Park said, checking her notes. He's had 3 break-ins this year, all targeting high-end electronics. Insurance company is starting to ask questions. They circled the building, looking for signs of entry. The back door was standing slightly ajar, with scratches around the lock that suggested someone had picked it rather than forced it open. Professional job, Sarah observed. Yeah, either very skilled thieves, or Park trailed off, frowning. Or what? Or someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to get it. They entered the store carefully, weapons drawn. The interior was in disarray, but not randomly destroyed. Whoever had broken and had searched systematically, focusing on specific areas and items. This is weird, Park said, holstering her weapon. Look at what they took. Sarah examined the store more carefully. The most expensive items, high-end cameras, laptops, and gaming systems were still in place. But several boxes of smaller electronics were missing, along with what appeared to be surveillance equipment. Why steal cheap electronics when there are thousands of dollars worth of equipment right here? Park wondered aloud. Sarah was thinking the same thing. This felt less like a robbery and more like someone acquiring specific tools for a particular job. Maybe they weren't after money. Then what? Before Sarah could answer, David Kim arrived, a nervous middle-aged man with graying hair and worried eyes. He confirmed that the stolen items were mostly surveillance gear, hidden cameras, listening devices, and GPS trackers. I don't understand, Kim said, wringing his hands. Why would anyone want that stuff? It's not even that valuable. Park exchanged a glance with Sarah. Surveillance equipment had very specific uses, and none of them were legal in the hands of criminals. Mr. Kim, Park said, I need you to think carefully. Has anyone been asking questions about your surveillance equipment lately? Any customers showing unusual interest? Kim nodded slowly. Actually, yes. About 2 weeks ago, a man came in asking very specific questions about range and battery life. He seemed to know a lot about electronics, more than most customers. Can you describe it? White male, maybe 40 years old, average height, but very fit. He had short hair, like military style, and he paid cash for a small GPS tracker, said it was for keeping track of his teenage daughter. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The description was vague, but familiar. It could match a dozen officers from her precinct. They finished taking Kim's statement and promised to file a full report, but Sarah's mind was racing. Someone was acquiring surveillance equipment, and the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Just days after her confrontation with Morrison, someone with possible law enforcement connections was gathering tools that could be used to monitor and track people. You're quiet, Park observed as they drove back to the precinct. Just thinking about the case. This wasn't random, Park said. Someone is planning something, and they needed specific equipment to do it. The question is what, and whether it's connected to anything else we're working on. Sarah nodded, but she was already forming her own theories. If someone wanted to monitor her, to gather intelligence about her habits and vulnerabilities, they need exactly the kind of equipment that had been stolen. Back at the precinct, Sarah used her lunch break to do some research. She accessed the department's database and ran a search for similar break-ins in the past month. What she found made her blood run cold. 3 other electronic stores had been robbed in the same manner, all within a 20-mile radius. In each case, the thieves had ignored expensive merchandise in favor of surveillance equipment. And in each case, the break-ins had occurred shortly after specific officers had been assigned to the cases. Officers including Jake Morrison. Sarah printed out the reports and studied them carefully. Morrison had responded to 2 of the break-ins personally, while his partners Ricci and Stevens had been involved in the other cases. It could be coincidence, but Sarah didn't believe in coincidences. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your locker." Sarah's heart rate spiked. She looked around the bullpen, but no one seemed to be paying attention to her. She deleted the text and made her way to the locker room, trying to appear casual. Her locker was exactly as she'd left it, with one exception. A manila envelope had been slipped through the ventilation slats. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "You're being watched." Morrison and his friends have been running a side business using stolen surveillance equipment to gather blackmail material on other officers. They know about your military background and plan to use it against you. Trust no one in the department. If you want proof, check the evidence locker. Box 247. Destroy this note. Sarah read the message twice, then used her lighter to burn it in the locker room sink. The ashes went down the drain, leaving no trace. Her mind was reeling. If the note was accurate, then Morrison wasn't just a bully. He was running a criminal enterprise from within the police department. The surveillance equipment, the knowledge of her classified background, the systematic targeting of rookies and female officers, it all fit a pattern of corruption and abuse of power. But who had sent the warning? And why should she trust them? Sarah spent the rest of her shift in a state of heightened alertness. Every conversation, every glance from her colleagues, carried new weight. If Morrison was blackmailing other officers, then anyone could be compromised. Even people who seemed friendly might be under his control. When her shift ended, Sarah made her way to the evidence locker. The clerk on duty was a bored-looking woman in her 50s who barely glanced up when Sarah signed in. "Need to check something for Detective Park," Sarah said, showing her badge. Box 247. It was filed under a case number she didn't recognize. When she opened it, she found exactly what the anonymous note had promised. Surveillance photos, audio recordings, and detailed dossiers on at least a dozen officers from her precinct. Sarah's hands shook as she flipped through the files. There were photos of married officers with women who weren't their wives, recordings of conversations about gambling debts and financial problems, and evidence of minor policy violations that could end careers if reported to Internal Affairs. At the bottom of the box was a file with her own name on it. Inside were copies of her classified military records, including mission reports that should have been sealed. Someone with Pentagon access had provided Morrison with detailed information about her service with the SEALs, including operations that were still classified at the highest levels. But that wasn't the worst part. Clipped to her file was a handwritten note in Morrison's distinctive scrawl. "Useful. Could be valuable asset or major liability, depending on compliance. Recommend aggressive recruitment or elimination." Sarah felt sick as the implications hit her. Morrison hadn't just been trying to intimidate her. He'd been evaluating her as a potential recruit for his criminal enterprise. When she'd refused to be intimidated, she'd moved from the asset column to the liability column. And Morrison had a track record of dealing with liabilities permanently. Sarah quickly photographed the most damaging documents with her phone, then replaced everything exactly as she'd found it. As she left the evidence room, she nodded casually to the clerk, but her mind was racing. She now had proof of Morrison's corruption, but she also had a much bigger problem. If he was willing to blackmail fellow officers and had access to classified military intelligence, then his network was larger and more dangerous than she'd imagined. And if the anonymous note was correct, she was already being watched. Sarah drove home through the evening traffic, constantly checking her mirrors for surveillance. She parked 3 blocks from her apartment and walked the rest of the way, taking a circuitous route that would reveal anyone following her. Her apartment appeared undisturbed, but Sarah wasn't taking any chances. She did a thorough sweep, checking for the kind of surveillance devices that had been stolen from David Kim's store. She found 2 bugs, one in her bedroom and another in her kitchen. Both were professional grade, the kind used by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Sarah left the devices in place, but made a note of their locations. If Morrison was listening, she wanted him to hear what she wanted him to hear. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, carefully planning her next moves. She had evidence of Morrison's corruption, but she couldn't trust anyone in the department to help her. The blackmail file suggested that Morrison had leverage over officers at every level, possibly including Captain Reynolds himself. She needed outside help, but that brought its own risks. If she contacted the FBI or Internal Affairs, Morrison would know she was moving against him. And if he had sources in federal law enforcement, which seemed possible given his access to classified information, then she could be walking into a trap. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled to Commander Chen's number. It was late, but this couldn't wait. Martinez? What's wrong? Chen's voice was immediately alert, recognizing the tension in Sarah's tone. Ma'am, I think the situation here is worse than we thought. I have evidence of systematic corruption, but I need help figuring out who to trust. Tell me everything. Sarah quickly outlined what she discovered. The surveillance equipment thefts, the blackmail files, Morrison's network within the department. Chen listened without interrupting, but Sarah could hear her typing notes as she spoke. Sarah, Chen said when she finished, you're in significant danger. This Morrison character isn't just a corrupt cop. He's running a sophisticated intelligence operation. And if he has access to your classified files, then someone in the Pentagon is either compromised or actively helping him. What do you recommend? I'm going to make some calls tonight. I have contacts in the FBI's public corruption unit who specialize in law enforcement misconduct. But in the meantime, you need to be extremely careful. Don't trust anyone in your department. Don't vary your routines too much. And for God's sake, don't let them know you've discovered their surveillance. After hanging up, Sarah felt marginally better. Help was coming, but it might take time to arrange. In the meantime, she was on her own. She spent the next hour creating encrypted backup copies of all the evidence she'd gathered, storing them in multiple secure locations. If something happened to her, at least there would be a record of what she discovered. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught herself checking the locks on her door for the 3rd time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she had no idea what Morrison might try next. But she was no longer the naive rookie who'd walked into his trap. She was a Navy SEAL who'd been given a mission: expose the corruption in her own department before it destroyed her or anyone else. And like every mission she'd ever accepted, failure was not an option. The game was changing, and Sarah intended to win. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of her phone ringing. The caller ID showed Commander Chen's number, which immediately put her on alert. Chen wouldn't call this early unless something urgent had happened. Martinez, I have bad news, Chen said without preamble. My FBI contact ran into a wall when he tried to open an investigation into your situation. Someone with significant influence shut it down before it even started. Sarah sat up in bed, fully awake now. What kind of influence? The kind that comes from very high up the food chain. Either someone in federal law enforcement is protecting Morrison, or this corruption network reaches further than we thought. So what do I do now? You're going to have to handle this internally, which means finding allies within your own department. But you need to be smart about it. Test people carefully, and don't reveal what you know until you're certain they can be trusted. After hanging up, Sarah stared at the ceiling in frustration. She was essentially on her own, surrounded by potentially compromised colleagues, with evidence of crimes that powerful people apparently didn't want investigated. But giving up wasn't in her nature. If anything, the obstacles just confirmed how important it was to stop Morrison before his corruption spread further. Sarah arrived at the precinct early, hoping to observe the morning dynamics before the official shift began. She positioned herself in the break room with a cup of coffee and the previous day's incident reports, watching as officers trickled in. Morrison arrived precisely at 6:45 a.m., his usual time according to her observations. He was moving more carefully than usual, clearly still feeling the effects of their encounter in the training room. But what caught Sarah's attention was the brief conversation he had with Sergeant Williams, the watch commander. Williams was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for honesty and integrity. If Morrison was trying to corrupt him, it would represent a significant expansion of his influence. Sarah strained to overhear their conversation, but could only catch fragments. Needs to be handled discreetly. Morrison was saying, I don't like it. Williams responded. Too risky. Trust me, I've done this before. The rookie won't be a problem much longer. Sarah's blood ran cold. They were talking about her, and Morrison was planning something that would end her career or worse. The conversation broke up as other officers entered the break room, but Sarah had heard enough. She needed to accelerate her timeline and find allies quickly. Detective Park seemed like the most promising candidate. She was sharp, observant, and had already shown suspicion about Morrison's activities. But approaching her required careful planning. Sarah's opportunity came during their morning patrol. They were called to investigate a burglary at a high-end apartment complex, the kind of case that would give them privacy to talk while they worked. The victim was a young tech executive named Michael Torres who claimed someone had broken into his apartment and stolen only a laptop and some documents. Like the electronics store robberies, it seemed oddly selective. This is the third burglary this month where thieves ignored valuable items in favor of electronics and paperwork, Park observed as they examined the scene. You think they're connected? Sarah asked. I think someone is building a profile database. Stealing personal information, financial records, anything that could be used for blackmail or identity theft. Sarah saw her opening. What if it's not random criminals? What if someone in law enforcement is involved? Park stopped examining the window and looked directly at Sarah. That's a serious accusation. What makes you think that? Pattern analysis. The break-ins are too sophisticated for street criminals, and they're targeting specific types of information. Plus, whoever is doing this has access to police response times and patrol schedules. You're talking about corruption within our own department. I'm talking about following the evidence wherever it leads. Park was quiet for several minutes as they finished documenting the scene. Finally, as they were leaving the building, she spoke again. There are rumors, she said quietly. Whispers about certain officers having more money than their salaries should allow. About cases being dropped for unexplained reasons. But rumors aren't evidence. What if I told you I had evidence? Park stopped walking. I'd say you better be very careful who you share that information with. And I want to know why you're trusting me. Sarah made a calculated decision. Because you're the only person in that precinct who seems to care more about the truth than politics. Show me, Park said. That evening, Sarah met Park at a small coffee shop several miles from the precinct. She'd chosen the location carefully, public enough to discourage violence, but private enough to talk freely. Sarah showed Park photos of the evidence files, the surveillance equipment inventories, and Morrison's handwritten notes. Park's expression grew darker as she reviewed each item. Jesus Christ, Park muttered. How long has this been going on? Based on the files, at least 2 years. Maybe longer. And you found all this in our own evidence locker? Along with surveillance devices planted in my apartment and detailed records of my classified military service. Park leaned back in her chair, absorbing the implications. This is massive. Morrison isn't just corrupt. He's running a criminal enterprise using police resources and authority. The question is, what do we do about it? We need more evidence. And we need to identify everyone involved. Those blackmail files suggest he has leverage over other officers, but we don't know if they're willing participants or victims. Sarah nodded. I've been thinking about that. If we can flip one of his accomplices, get them to testify about the operation. Ricci might be our best bet. He's not as smart as Morrison, and he's probably more afraid of prison time. They spent the next hour developing a plan. It was risky. If Morrison discovered what they were doing, both their careers and potentially their lives would be in danger. But the alternative was allowing the corruption to continue spreading. There's something else you need to know, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. My former commanding officer tried to get the FBI involved, but someone shut down the investigation before it started. Park's face went pale. You're saying this reaches into federal law enforcement? I'm saying someone with serious influence wants to keep this buried. Then, we're really on our own. Sarah nodded grimly. Which means we have to be perfect. One mistake, and Morrison wins. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Captain Reynolds called Sarah into his office before the shift briefing, his expression unreadable. Officer Martinez, I've been reviewing your performance reports from Detective Murphy and Detective Park. Both have given you excellent marks. Thank you, sir. However, I've also been hearing some concerning rumors. There are suggestions that you've been involved in some kind of conflict with other officers. Sarah kept her expression neutral. I'm not aware of any conflict, sir. Reynolds studied her for a long moment. Let me be clear, Martinez. This department operates on trust and cooperation. If there are problems between officers, they need to be resolved quickly and quietly. We can't afford to have internal disputes affecting our ability to serve the public. Understand, sir. Good. Because I'd hate to see a promising young officer's career derailed by interpersonal issues. The message was clear. Someone had complained about her, probably Morrison, and Reynolds was under pressure to address it. Whether the captain was compromised or simply trying to maintain department morale, Sarah couldn't tell. Is there anything specific you'd like me to address, sir? Just be careful who you trust, Martinez. And remember that loyalty goes both ways in this department. As Sarah left the captain's office, she felt the net tightening around her. Morrison was moving to isolate her, using official channels to build a case for her dismissal or transfer. She needed to accelerate her investigation before he could eliminate her as a threat. That afternoon, Sarah and Park got their opportunity. They were called to assist with a traffic stop that had escalated into a potential drug bust. The arresting officers were Morrison and Stevens, and they'd requested backup while they searched the suspect's vehicle. Sarah and Park arrived to find Morrison standing over a young Hispanic man who was lying face down on the pavement in handcuffs. The man was bleeding from his nose, and his shirt was torn. "What happened here?" Park asked. "Suspect resisted arrest," Morrison said casually. "Had to use appropriate force to subdue him." Sarah looked at the scene more carefully. The suspect appeared to be about 19 years old, small and thin. He was shaking with fear, and there were no signs that he'd put up any kind of fight. His car was a beat-up Honda Civic that didn't look capable of outrunning a bicycle, let alone a police cruiser. "Did you read his rights?" Park asked. "Of course," Stevens replied, but he seemed nervous. Sarah knelt beside the suspect, who was mumbling something in Spanish. She'd picked up enough of the language during her military service to understand that he was saying, "I didn't do anything over and over again." "What's your name?" Sarah asked in Spanish. The young man looked up at her with grateful eyes. "Miguel Santos. I was just driving to work." "What kind of drugs did you find?" Park asked Morrison. Morrison pointed to a small bag of white powder sitting on the hood of the patrol car. "Cocaine, hidden under a spare tire." Sarah studied the bag. Something about it looked off, too clean, too perfectly positioned. She'd seen enough drug busts to know that cocaine hidden in a spare tire compartment would typically be dirty and wrapped in multiple layers. "Miguel," she said quietly in Spanish, "did they plant drugs in your car?" The young man's eyes widened with hope. "Yes. I swear on my mother's grave, I never seen that before in my life. They pulled me over for nothing, then one of them went to my trunk while the other one hit me." Sarah translated for Park, who immediately tensed. They were witnessing a frame-up in progress, probably one of many that Morrison and Stevens had perpetrated. "That's a serious allegation," Morrison said, apparently understanding enough Spanish to follow the conversation. "You sure you want to take the word of a drug dealer over fellow officers?" "I want to do this by the book," Sarah replied. "That means getting witness statements, documenting the arrest procedure, and making sure everything is properly processed." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Since when does a rookie tell senior officers how to handle arrests?" "Since I swore an oath to uphold the law," Sarah said calmly. The tension on the scene was escalating rapidly. Stevens kept glancing between Morrison and the growing crowd of bystanders who had stopped to watch the arrest. Park was taking detailed notes and photos, clearly documenting everything for potential later use. "Martinez," Morrison said quietly, "you need to step back and let us handle this." "I think we should call for a supervisor," Sarah replied. Morrison's face flushed red. "Are you questioning our judgment?" "I'm following proper procedure." For a moment, Sarah thought Morrison might actually lose control and attack her in front of witnesses. His hands clenched into fists, and she could see the rage building behind his eyes. But Stevens grabbed his partner's arm. "Come on, Jake. Let's just book him and let the DA sort it out." Morrison jerked away from Stevens, but seemed to regain some control. "Fine. But this conversation isn't over, Martinez." As the scene wound down and Miguel Santos was transported to booking, Park pulled Sarah aside. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said. "Probably both. But did you see how clean that cocaine was? And Miguel's injuries were consistent with being hit while cuffed, not while resisting arrest." "I saw. The question is, what do we do about it?" "We document everything and add it to our evidence file." Morrison just gave us a first-hand look at his methods. But Sarah knew the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison was no longer content to operate in the shadows. He was becoming increasingly bold, confident that his network would protect him from consequences. That night, Sarah found a new message slipped under her apartment door. "You're running out of time. Back off now, or face the consequences." No signature, but the meaning was clear. Morrison had escalated from surveillance to direct threats. Sarah called Park immediately. "We need to move faster. He's getting desperate." "Agreed. I've been thinking about our conversation with Ricci. What if we approach him directly, told him we know about the operation?" "That's extremely risky. Everything we're doing is risky." But Ricci struck me as the weak link in their group. He might be willing to flip if we can convince him that Morrison is going down either way. Sarah considered it. Ricci was definitely the follower rather than the leader, and he'd seemed genuinely shaken by their encounter in the training room. If they could get him alone, away from Morrison's influence. How do we arrange a meeting without Morrison knowing? Leave that to me. Ricci's got a gambling problem. I've heard him talking about poker games on Friday nights. I can track down the location and approach him there. It was a long shot, but it might be their only chance to break the case open before Morrison eliminated them as threats. "Okay," Sarah said, "but we go in with backup plans. If this goes wrong, we need evidence in place to protect ourselves." "Already working on it. I prepared sealed copies of everything we've collected and stored them with a lawyer friend. If anything happens to either of us, they get released automatically." As Sarah hung up, she realized they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Tomorrow night, they would either break Morrison's criminal network or become its latest victims. The rookie who'd walked into the precinct just days ago was gone forever. In her place was a warrior preparing for the most important battle of her career. The underground poker game was held in the basement of a rundown bar on the outskirts of the city. Sarah and Park had spent hours planning their approach, studying the location and identifying escape routes. They couldn't afford to be trapped if things went wrong. Park entered the bar first, dressed casually and carrying enough cash to buy into the game. Sarah waited in her car across the street, monitoring police frequencies and watching for any sign of Morrison or Stevens. If this was a trap, they'd know within minutes. 20 minutes later, Park's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece. "Target acquired. He's here, and he's losing badly. Might be our best chance to approach him." Sarah waited another 10 minutes before making her own entrance. The bar was exactly what she'd expected. Dim lighting, stale beer smell, and the kind of clientele that didn't ask questions about strangers. She made her way downstairs to the basement, where a dozen men sat around two poker tables. Tony Ricci was easy to spot. He was hunched over his cards at the far table, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool basement air. The stack of chips in front of him was pitifully small, and his body language screamed desperation. Sarah caught Park's eye and nodded toward the bar in the corner. They'd agreed that Park would continue playing while Sarah made the approach. If Ricci spooked, they needed someone in position to follow him. Sarah ordered a beer and positioned herself near Ricci's table, close enough to observe but not so close as to seem threatening. She waited until he folded a hand and stepped away from the table, clearly frustrated. "Rough night?" she asked casually as he approached the bar. Ricci looked up, startled. His eyes widened when he recognized her. "Martinez? What the hell are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, I imagine. Trying to unwind after a long week." Ricci glanced around nervously. "Look, if Jake sent you to check up on me, Morrison doesn't know I'm here. In fact, I'd prefer to keep it that way. Then, why are you here?" Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice. "Because I think we need to talk. About what's been happening at the precinct." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do, Tony. The surveillance equipment, the blackmail files, the frame jobs. I know about all of it." Ricci's face went pale. "You're crazy. You don't know anything. I know you're in over your head. I know Morrison is using you, and I know you're scared." Sarah kept her tone gentle but insistent. "The question is whether you want to keep being his victim or if you want a way out." Ricci stared at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his eyes. "You're wearing a wire." "No, I'm not. But even if I was, what would I record? You haven't admitted to anything yet. What do you want?" "I want to give you a chance to do the right thing before it's too late." Ricci laughed bitterly. "The right thing? Do you have any idea what Morrison would do to me if I crossed him?" "I have a pretty good idea what he's going to do to you anyway, once you're no longer useful." That hit home. Ricci's expression shifted from defiance to genuine fear. "He's got dirt on everyone," Ricci said quietly. "Pictures, recordings, financial records. Even if someone wanted to talk, They couldn't without destroying themselves. What kind of dirt does he have on you? Ricci was quiet for several minutes, staring into his beer. Finally, he spoke. My ex-wife. She's got custody of my kids, but she's been letting me see them off the books. The court order says supervised visits only, but she's been bringing them to my place on weekends. His voice broke slightly. If Morrison reports that, I'll lose my kids forever. Sarah felt a surge of sympathy for the man. Morrison wasn't just a criminal. He was a predator who identified people's vulnerabilities and exploited them ruthlessly. Tony, listen to me. I have evidence that Morrison has been committing serious crimes. Theft, blackmail, conspiracy, civil rights violations. When this comes out, and it will come out, the only thing that's going to matter is whether you were part of the solution or part of the problem. You don't understand. Even if I wanted to help, Morrison has contingency plans. If anything happens to him, all those files get released automatically. Everyone he has dirt on goes down with him. That's only true if we play by his rules. But what if we could take down the entire network at once, before he has a chance to activate his insurance policies? Ricci looked at her with something approaching hope. Ow! By gathering enough evidence to arrest everyone simultaneously. Morrison, Stevens, whoever else is involved, and anyone who's been helping them from outside the department. You need access to all the files, all the surveillance equipment, everything. Where does he keep it? Ricci hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Storage unit on Industrial Boulevard. Unit 247. But it's got electronic locks, cameras, the whole setup. You can't get in there without setting off alarms. Sarah smiled. Let me worry about that. What I need from you is information about his schedule, his routines when he accesses the unit. Usually Sunday nights, around 11 p.m. Reviews everything, plans the next week's operations. This Sunday, as far as I know. Sarah stood up, leaving money on the bar for her untouched beer. Tony, you're going to have one chance to be on the right side of history. Don't waste it. She walked away before he could respond, but she'd seen something shift in his eyes. Fear was being replaced by determination, and that was exactly what she needed. Back in her car, Sarah filled Park in on the conversation. They now had a location and a timeline, but breaking into Morrison's storage unit would require careful planning and possibly a legal entry. We need official backup for this, Park said. If we're caught breaking into that storage unit without a warrant, everything we find gets thrown out of court. And if we try to get a warrant through official channels, Morrison finds out and destroys everything before we can act. They sat in silence for several minutes, both recognizing the impossible position they were in. There is one option, Sarah said finally. Someone higher up the food chain who might be willing to help. Ooh, internal affairs. If we can convince them to fast-track an investigation based on what we've already collected, that's assuming IA isn't compromised too. It's a risk we'll have to take. The next morning, Sarah and Park met with Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison from the Internal Affairs Division. Harrison was a stern-faced man in his 50s with a reputation for absolutely ruthless integrity. If anyone in the department could be trusted to handle a corruption case properly, it was him. Sarah laid out their evidence methodically. The surveillance equipment thefts, the blackmail files, the planted drugs, Morrison's access to classified military records. Harrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. This is extensive, he said finally. If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at the largest police corruption case in the city's history. We have a lead on where Morrison keeps his files, Park added, but we need official support to access them legally. Harrison nodded slowly. I can get you a warrant, but it'll take time. At least 48 hours to work through the system without alerting anyone who might be compromised. We don't have 48 hours, Sarah said. Morrison is escalating. He's getting desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. As if to emphasize her point, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Last warning. Drop your investigation or face permanent consequences. Harrison saw the message, and his expression hardened. That's a direct threat against a police officer. We can use this to accelerate the warrant process. How long? Give me until tonight. I'll have everything ready by tomorrow morning. But as they left the IA office, Sarah had a sinking feeling that they were running out of time. Morrison's threats were becoming more direct, more urgent. He was planning something, and waiting another day might be too long. Her instincts proved correct when she arrived home that evening to find her apartment door standing open. Sarah drew her service weapon and approached carefully, using the door frame for cover. The apartment had been systematically destroyed, furniture overturned, belongings scattered, walls damaged. But this wasn't random vandalism. Someone had been looking for something. She cleared each room methodically, but the intruders were long gone. They'd found her hidden copies of the evidence files and destroyed them, along with her laptop and any other electronics that might contain incriminating information. But they'd missed something. Sarah went to her bedroom closet and moved aside several boxes to reveal a small floor safe. Inside were backup copies of everything, stored on encrypted drives that Morrison's people wouldn't have known to look for. Her phone rang. Morrison's voice was calm and almost friendly. "I hope you got my message, Martinez." "Which message was that? Breaking into my home or threatening me via text?" "I prefer to think of it as a negotiation. You have something that belongs to me, and I have something you might want to keep." "Such as?" "Your life, your career, your future." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you want?" "Simple. You're going to resign from the department, effective immediately. You're going to move out of the city, preferably out of the state. And you're going to forget everything you think you know about my business operations. And if I don't, then you'll discover that police work can be a very dangerous profession. Officers get killed in the line of duty all the time, and nobody questions it when they die heroically fighting criminals." The threat was clear and chilling. Morrison wasn't just talking about ending her career. He was talking about killing her and making it look like a legitimate police death. "I need time to think about it," Sarah said. "You have until tomorrow night. After that, the offer expires, and we move to more permanent solutions." The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone in her destroyed apartment with a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. She called Park immediately. "It's over. Morrison knows about the investigation, and he's given me an ultimatum: leave town or die. We can't let him win. We might not have a choice." But even as Sarah said the words, she was already planning her next move. She'd spent 6 years as a Navy SEAL, taking on impossible missions against overwhelming odds. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a corrupt cop, no matter how dangerous he might be. Morrison had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that threatening her would make her back down. Instead, he just declared war on someone who was very, very good at fighting wars. The next evening, Sarah positioned herself near Morrison's storage unit facility, watching and waiting. She'd sent Park detailed instructions on when to contact internal affairs and how to coordinate with federal authorities. If this went wrong, at least the investigation would continue. Morrison arrived precisely at 11 p.m., just as Ricci had predicted. He was alone, confident in his security arrangements, and certain that Sarah was somewhere far away, packing her belongings and preparing to flee. Sarah waited until he was inside the storage unit, then moved swiftly to disable the exterior cameras and alarm system. Her SEAL training had included extensive work with electronic security systems, and Morrison's setup was sophisticated but not military grade. She positioned herself outside the unit's entrance and waited. When Morrison emerged 20 minutes later, she was standing in the shadows with her service weapon drawn. "Hello, Jake." Morrison spun around, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "Martinez? What the hell are you doing here? Ending this. You're under arrest for corruption, blackmail, theft, and about a dozen other charges." Morrison laughed. "You can't arrest me. You're alone, you have no backup, and anything you find here will be inadmissible in court. Maybe, but I don't need a conviction to destroy you. All I need is to survive long enough to get this information to the right people." "That's not going to happen." Morrison's hand finished its movement to his weapon, but Sarah had been expecting it. Before he could clear leather, she'd closed the distance between them and disarmed him with a precise strike that left his wrist broken and his gun skittering across the concrete floor. Morrison staggered backward, cradling his injured arm. "You're making a huge mistake. Do you have any idea how many people I have working for me? How far this reaches?" "I'm about to find out." Sarah secured Morrison with zip ties and then examined the contents of the storage unit. What she found exceeded even her worst expectations. Morrison had files on over 50 police officers, detailed blackmail schemes involving multiple departments, and evidence of connections to organized crime figures throughout the region. But the most shocking discovery was a thick file labeled Federal Assets. Inside were communications with someone identified only as Phoenix, who appeared to be coordinating Morrison's activities with a larger network of corrupted law enforcement officials across multiple states. Sarah photographed everything quickly, knowing that backup would arrive soon. Morrison had probably activated some kind of panic signal, and she needed to be gone before his people showed up. "This isn't over," Morrison said as Sarah prepared to leave. "Even if you expose everything, Phoenix will just start over somewhere else. You have no idea how big this really is." "Then, I guess I'll have to find out." Sarah left Morrison tied up in the storage unit and called Park with a predetermined code phrase that meant "mission successful, initiate federal contact protocols." By morning, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had taken over the investigation. Morrison and 15 other officers were arrested simultaneously, along with several federal agents who had been part of the network. The storage unit yielded enough evidence to guarantee convictions for everyone involved. Tony Ricci, true to his word, cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for immunity and protection for his family. His testimony filled in the gaps in the documentary evidence and provided crucial details about the network's operations. 3 months later, Sarah stood in Captain Reynolds' office, wearing a detective's badge on her uniform. The captain, who had been completely unaware of Morrison's activities, had personally recommended her for promotion after learning about her role in exposing the corruption. "You know, Martinez," Reynolds said, "when I first met you, I thought you were just another rookie who might not last 6 months on the job. What changed your mind, sir?" Reynolds smiled. "I realized that sometimes the person who looks like they don't belong is exactly the person you need to shake things up. You've probably saved this department from complete collapse." As Sarah left the captain's office, she reflected on how much had changed since her first day. The quiet rookie who had tried so hard to fit in was gone, replaced by a confident detective who understood that sometimes fighting corruption required the same skills she'd used fighting enemies overseas. Her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Chun. "Heard about your promotion. Proud of you, SEAL. Stay dangerous." Sarah smiled as she walked through the precinct. Officers who had once ignored her now nodded respectfully as she passed. The culture was changing, slowly but surely. There were still challenges ahead. The FBI investigation had revealed that Morrison's network extended into other departments and federal agencies. Phoenix remained unidentified, and there were indications that similar corruption rings existed in other cities. But Sarah was no longer worried about those challenges. She learned that the skills that made her an effective Navy SEAL, careful observation, strategic thinking, absolute determination, and the willingness to fight when fighting was necessary, made her an equally effective police detective. She'd started this journey as a rookie, trying to find her place in a new career. She was ending it as exactly what the police department needed: a warrior committed to protecting and serving no matter what the cost. The broken teeth had healed, but the lessons they'd taught her would last forever. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who ends up changing everything. And Sarah Martinez was just getting started.